This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a senior lecturer at Tel Aviv University's Department of English and American Studies and the head of the Center for U.S. Studies there. He is the co-editor, together with Ilan Peleg, of a new book titled The Americanization of the Israeli Right, published in Hebrew by the Center for U.S. Studies at Tel Aviv University. Dr. Yoav Fromer, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So the Americanization of the Israeli right could appear as a contradiction in terms, because the right, in Israel as much as elsewhere, likes to see itself as homegrown, self-sufficient, exceptional. How do you approach that?
Well, maybe that was the case once, and for some people, right, it's very difficult to speak of the right in one monolithic manner, right? Obviously, it's fragmented, and there's competing strains within it. But I think that one of the most interesting things that we're seeing in this phenomenon, this is what the book really tries to engage, is the importation of certain values, ideas, means of organization, discourses that are quite particular to the United States. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not a global phenomenon. Of course, it is. Right, right-wing populism is something we've seen in the last 20 years as maybe the most salient political phenomenon. Right, in Brazil and in Hungary and in France and in Italy and so forth, India. So certainly it's not only something local, American in that sense, but there is something particularly American about what's happening in Israel, which is derived from the fact that Israel and the United States, right, the so-called special relationship, they are so close, and also just the networks of Jewish Americans, right, and people who live here, who live there, right, or maybe many of our listeners are among these people, right. So these ideas, right, they cross the Atlantic quite often, and I think so. There's something very particular,
and it's interesting because you shed light specifically on the Israeli right, and as you say, it's a pretty recent phenomenon. Because when we speak about Americanization, first and foremost, we look at it as some sort of a cultural phenomenon, right? We're talking about Hollywood and American cultural hegemony and whatever. So when you're talking about Americanization, people usually talk about that, and politically. In the Israeli case, but again, not only, it means things like, social movements and civil rights discourse, something that started, has been imported into Israel from the 1960s onward. But the phenomena that you talk about in this specific context of the Israeli right are pretty recent.
Right. So Americanization really is also. It's almost synonymous with globalization, right? And as you said, it's not something particular to Israel. We know that really since the second half of the 20th century, right, in terms, you talked about Americanization as a cultural phenomenon, you mentioned Hollywood, but certainly first and foremost, just in terms of consumption, right, in terms of our taste, in terms of what people do in their leisure, in terms of economic policy management, right, what we call today neoliberal economics, right, this is your more modern form of capitalism as a way of organizing our economies. All of these things are really American, and they are an expression of American hegemony since, the period after World War II. So in that sense, there is an Americanization, which is a global process. And you mentioned first just things like Hollywood, that have to do with consumption tastes. That's one thing that's been around really since Israel was founded, right? And that's not unique to Israel. That's one thing. And then you mentioned the second thing, the influence on the left. And this is something very important because for decades, and also there's a lot of academic scholarship about this, yes, Israel has imported a lot of things from American liberalism, the whole civil liberties discourse you mentioned, I think, right, women's rights, feminism, LGBTQ rights, environmental movements, the Israeli peace movement, right, in the 70s and 80s, much of that does try to import some of the, the values, the tactics for organization from the New Left in the United States. So that certainly is something that's been around. However, what is unique, I think, this is why we created the project that led to this book. It started as a conference in 2021, and then that it developed into a book. Was the idea that something new is happening, something new in Israel is happening really since the late 1990s, early 2000s, that was unique to the Israeli right. Now, again, this doesn't mean that we don't have the other things still going on, right? The cultural, the social, socioeconomic stuff on the left. But this is something I think it's more recent, it's more potent, and I think personally, it's much more ambitious. And that's why I think it deserves much more attention.
There's an interesting question about outside influences, and of course it's been weaponized by people on both sides. To what extent is something, actually imposing themselves on another country? I mean, it's outside influences in the perhaps negative terms, or to what extent is it an outside influence encouraging homegrown, local strains that are in society already? How do you look at the tension between the two?
Well, it's the boundaries are very blurry, right? And you don't know you can't really put your finger on. Wait, is this Israelis who want to change Israel and make it more conservative and American? Wait, no, or is it American philanthropists, Jewish American philanthropists who are trying to make Israel more conservative, more neoliberal? So that shift, I can't put my finger on it. I think it's both, because you couldn't establish these institutions, these ideas, these organizations in Israel without having some kind of local ambitions that want to establish and institutionalize these ideas here. But
the same applies for the left, by the way. Right?
Yes, but there is a qualitative difference. This is always something people raise, right? I think, and again, when we see the way the left has imported these ideas, it was much more limited or narrow, I think, in scope, right? So looking at how the new left is advancing women's rights or feminism or LGBTQ. So they're looking at tactics, at fundraising, at language, right? At how to get the message out, at how to organize. Here, I think, and this is also something which is many of the institutions of the people who are funding this, they admit to this. Here, I think it's a bit more ambitious, and it's really changing the structures of Israeli society. And so that, I think, just in terms of the qualitative way in which they're intervening, maybe, right? I think it's a bit more different because it's trying to transform Israeli society, which I don't think exactly was the previous attempt.
Transform in what way? Can you develop that?
Well, it depends who you're asking here, right? But I think for some, at least, it's this dream of this neoliberal, neoconservative utopia, like Kansas or something was 20 years ago, in the height of it, kind of this conservative, ultra-conservatism, right? In that sense, and I don't just we also need to talk about what conservatism means, but here I think. It means transforming Israel first and foremost in a socioeconomic and a legal manner. This is things we don't talk about enough because we're always thinking naturally about the war, or about the security situation, about the Palestinians, about terrorism, about Iran.
You mean Israelis?
Israel, of course, right. Israel, I think also a lot of American Jews, when they think of Israel, they're like, oh, well, that's their problems. But that, in a sense, is something which I don't think it's nefarious or something, or conspiratorial, but that's a distraction for a lot of people, because that's what we're dealing with, certainly since October 7th. But that also allows some people to say, well, now is the time to change the socioeconomic foundations of Israel, the legal structure, and the whole, the whole controversy and protest against the judicial reforms. It's this recognition among some who are opposing it, both on the right and the left. Right? Remember, a lot of people are opposing this on the right as well, people like Benny Begin and so forth, because they understand that this is a fundamental transformation of Israeli foundations. It's not cosmetic. It's not just narrow, like saying, right, let's enhance gay rights, right? Something like in the 70s and 80s, some of the Israeli civil society organizations were doing.
Right. So maybe this is the reason why it came so late, because American conservatism was very different up until pretty recently, and Israeli conservatism was also something different from American conservatism, if it existed at all. I mean, it is. We can argue whether there is such a thing as Israeli conservative or ever has been.
Right. So here's the oxymoron kind of that we have to deal with is the term conservatism. How can a young, Israel's one of the youngest states in the world. How can a young state, which is a revolutionary state, Zionism is a revolutionary force, right? You read Herzl, certainly the founders, even Ben Gurion, this is what they were envisioning, right? So here's that fundamental problem, right, for conservatives, because if Zionism is a revolutionary movement, and it is, then what is conservative about it? Now in that sense, I think you think about Jabotinsky and Begin, right, and the Cherut and so forth, and the
revisionist,
right, the revisionist that would become the Likud party, even though today's Likud party has absolutely nothing that resembles, in my opinion at least, that resembles the founding fathers, right? But yeah, it was a very different vision of what of Israel. And when they sought to conserve that vision, it's a vision. First of all, it's a socio-democratic vision, right? And that's very important. It's a vision that has a certain civic responsibility. What Ben Gurion, of course, establishes mamlachtiyut, right? Which again, it's difficult to translate that term, right? But it's not exactly nationalism or patriotism, right? But it's a certain loyalty to the state. It's a civic virtue, I think, that we have, that you put the state above all else, not necessarily in a fascist sense, right? But just in a sense of this is our collective expression, right? In a Republican sense. So that was the way that Israelis, both on the right and the left, were always envisioning. I think if you're a conservative, and that's what you're conservative, Zionism, Ben Gurion's vision, Jabotinsky's vision, despite the fundamental disagreements they had, there was a shared vision, I think, of Zionism. And now in the last 20 years, and again, we can talk what happened, what changed in the last 20 years. I think that's an interesting question. But now you see that there's a new attempt to define what conservatism in Israel means, and that is something foreign, I think. And here's where the American connection comes in.
Yes and no, because I think that it really is the end result of a process of the popularization of the right, both in America and in Israel. And this populist turn is where the two meet at the end of the day. I mean, it's no coincidence that, if we personify these political trends, Trump and Netanyahu are so aligned on so many things, because they stand for a similar turn in what the right in America and Israel has become.
So populism is a very important, I think, term to bring into this conversation. But when we look at what's happening in Israel, and again, this is something very ironic and strange. In America, Trump is a rejection of conservatism, right? Trump, I'm a historian of American conservatism. Right, not Israeli, American conservatism, and Trump is a rejection. And really, he's a result of the failure of American conservatism. I think American conservatism, as it developed, after World War II, during the Cold War, and it climaxes with Reagan, right? And in the 1990s with Newt Gingrich, what was called the Contract with America. And it really ends with Bush, with the second Bush administration, as arguably one of the worst administrations in American political history. And Trump is the result of that, right? It's the reaction to that and saying, well, that conservatism totally failed. It failed economically, of course, with the 2008 financial crisis. It failed geopolitically with the Iraq War, which to this day is considered a huge catastrophe. Also for Israel, by the way, I think geopolitically. It failed with Katrina, right, with the government's inability to govern and just to rescue and save American citizens. So Trump, I think, is the alternative on the right, because if conservatism isn't working, here's a new brand of right-wing populism, right? So when we bring this idea to Israel, I think it's very different because here's the irony, that most of these institutions and conversations are funded by people with a lot of money and a lot of power, right? So what we would call elites, right? And so it's these elites that many of them are American and Jewish, right, that are coming here, or at least they're exporting their money and their ideas here, and they're helping to facilitate a populist movement, right? You mentioned Netanyahu. Now, again, many of them aren't I think many of them don't support Netanyahu. Many of them are horrified by what Netanyahu did. This is what they thought was going to happen 20, 30 years ago when they were investing the money and they were thinking about this project. They had America in mind. I think they wanted to do what Reagan did in America, but the outcome is, it kind of blew up in their face because I don't think the type of Netanyahu, well, this is different because Netanyahu 15 years ago, of course, was very different. He was a totally different person, right? And he wasn't a populist in the way he has become.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is like very interesting on so many levels, but I will try to maybe tackle them one by one. When you say that they had a totally different vision, I mean, when we look at the American support for the government's latest reforms, judicial overhaul, however you want to call it, it is already a very radical proposition. I mean, the Kohelet Forum that everyone's talking about, that is, again, I mean, we can discuss that forever, whether it is a properly Israeli institution or something that was imposed from the outside, again, bankrolled by a lot of American dollars. But also, when you look at, I mean, Netanyahu's maybe a civil agenda was different 15 years ago, but certainly his security agenda was pretty much similar to what it is today. It has, gone off the edge in certain aspects, but still, he was a hawkish hardliner. And also, if you look at some of the intellectuals that you also tackle in the book, like Yoram Chazoni, for example. I mean, it's not a mild version of American conservatism. It had a very significant radical streak from the very beginning, and we're talking about 30 and 40 years ago. Yeah, I'm interested in the balance between the milder version of conservatism in America and in Israel and the more radical one, and how that transformation occurred.
So I think one of the distinctions is, and again, this is a basic one that we use often in political science, but I think it's something that's elite-driven, right? Donors, philanthropists, elites like Yoram Hazony, for example, not only, and the more populist strain, which has grown and become much more dominant, both on the Israeli and the American right. And again, those tensions have always been there. At the beginning of American conservatism in the 50s, right? Part of its success is because people like Joe McCarthy, right, which today is infamous, right, for kind of no one wants to be associated with McCarthyism and Joe McCarthy, but he was the most powerful figure on the American right that allows all these elites in the Republican Party, people like William Buckley, who's very important, kind of the founder of National Review, and and even Eisenhower, Nixon, the president and vice president, they used him because they understood that this populist strain is very powerful, but they thought they could control him in that sense of kind of curtailing him when he was going off the edge and things like that. And they could use him to advance conservative ends. The
classic conservative misconception.
Right. And of course, that never happened. It's always, what we call in Hebrew, a golem kamal yitzro, right? So in that sense, it always, it blows up in their face. Trump was the same thing, by the way. A lot of conservative elites in the Republican Party, people like Mitch McConnell, right? The head of the Republican then majority in the Senate, they thought they could use Trump, because he was so powerful, and then that they could restrain him. Of course, that never happens. So that's just one thing. About Netanyahu, I think, again, I there's the first chapter really in our book by co-editor Professor Ilan Peleg is about Netanyahu, and Ilan thinks really, as you said, that Netanyahu is an ideologue, that he's always driven by the security, hawkish, neoconservative ideology. That's what the chapter is about. I'm not sure about that, and it's a great riddle. I think is he a pragmatist? Because again, one of the myths, and partly this is a myth that Netanyahu keeps rewriting. Again, by his own manipulations, unfortunately, it's this idea that, Netanyahu, he signs many, we remember this in the late 90s, he not only doesn't he put an end to Oslo, to the Oslo Agreement process, he develops it quite thoroughly. He's responsible, among other things, the withdrawal from Hebron, right, which is a very important part of the Oslo disengagement from the West Bank. He supported the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, which again he's totally erased it from the Israeli, historical record, but he votes for this in the Knesset and all these things, right? And again, I say this not to disparage him. On the contrary, I think these were responsible decisions that he did as a pragmatist. Netanyahu gives the Bar Ilan speech in his first, after coming back in 2009, right, where he recognizes de facto an eventual Palestinian state, right, as did Trump's plan, by the way, a couple of years ago when, Trump's, what was it, the deal of the century or whatever he calls it. It also, the end was that's why a lot of the settlers in Israel didn't want it. The end was a Palestinian state. So with Netanyahu, again, it's difficult to know, I think, if he's an ideologue, if he's a pragmatist.
More interesting thing about Netanyahu, I mean, there's many interesting things about Netanyahu, especially trying to understand the riddle, but also the fact that he was considered from the very beginning of his political career as an American politician. I mean,
yes,
exactly, because his formative years, both as a politician and as a person, were in America, and he comes across as an American, both in the way he speaks and the way he carries himself. And other than the fact that he is virtually one of the, if not the most influential politician in modern history, I mean, to what extent was Netanyahu himself responsible for the Americanization of Israeli politics? Not so much ideology, but the politics itself. And there's a chapter in the book about campaigning, right. And also maybe you can speak on behalf of your co-editor, Professor Ilan Peleg, maybe a bit more about Netanyahu, the contribution of Netanyahu to the Americanization of Israeli party politics. I mean, how politics is done on the most fundamental level.
So you're right. And think, again, Netanyahu, it's also a question of timing, right? So, Netanyahu, his formative years, first of all, as a kid, right? He grows up, I think, around the Philadelphia area, right? Because his father's already a professor in the United States and several institutions. But also, I think the 1980s are really important. Sorry, Netanyahu was the UN ambassador, of course, right? In the 80s, under Reagan. And I think so he looks at what's happening on the American right, with Reagan especially. And you're right. I think for Netanyahu, what's more important isn't the ideology. It's the methodology of how to do politics. That's the Americanization of Israel that Netanyahu at least contributes, right? In that sense of media, just the understanding how to use the media, how to misuse, how to abuse, to manipulate the media, right? Of course, he's aided, right, Arthur Finkelstein, among others, but here's one very important, famous or infamous, depends how you think about it, political consultant, right, guru, that aids Netanyahu, in the formative years. But he brings a lot of these tactics to Israel. Ilan writes about it, but Gabi Weiman, right? Professor Gabi Weiman from Haifa University writes a chapter in our book about how Netanyahu brings to Israel all of these ways of campaigning. Now, again, he's not the only one, right? Because we know, I mean, some people, Chich does this also for the Tel Aviv municipality, even before Netanyahu.
The legendary mayor
of Tel Aviv, right? Shlomo Lat. So it's already, again, this is a global phenomenon of suddenly, I think first and foremost is the personalization, right? Because Israel is a parliamentary democracy. Parties are so important in Israel, in Europe as well, right? It's different than in the United States because we have there, right, the separation of powers. You vote for president directly. In Israel, in Europe, it's parliamentary. So the party is what matters. But Netanyahu understands that's changing. So in the 90s under him, I think he brings the personalization of politics from the United States, which also, again, the unintended consequences that it really weakens parties. And again, in political science, that's not a good thing because parties moderate. You look today at what's happening in all the Israeli parties, by the way, also kind of on the left and the center, not just there. It's all about the person. It's not about the party, right? So it's not about the ideology. It's about, who's this person? That, of course, is facilitated by social media and just who's more provocative and crazy and who says, But
also, there's no more factions within parties in Israel anymore. I mean, it's exceptionally visible in Likud that they're all speaking the same line. There's really hardly any, I wouldn't say ideological disagreements, but any disagreements at all.
Well, it's the question if there's any ideology left other than the leader, right? And you're right. It's what matters is who's the person who you're selling, you're marketing, whether it's Netanyahu or Lapid or Gantz, right? But that's all that matters. Again, I don't want to glorify the situation, but certainly in Israel, but also I think in a lot of European countries, what mattered were the ideas. And again, the party moderates because there's different factions. Certainly we know this in the history of the Israeli Labor Party and Mapai. This was also true about the Likud. That's why they split up, a lot of them, and they were bifurcated inside because of so many factions. But that's moderating because it forces the party to be a wider tent, right, and to moderate on the edges. Now it's the exact opposite. All you have is the leader. In the Likud's case, it's been Netanyahu for the last 15 plus years. And what he says is the ideology, right? And again, the Republican Party, unfortunately, is also, has become under Trump.
I want to go back to the new Israeli and American right and talk about really a fundamental component in it that's become more and more visible over time. And that is, first of all, religion. You write in the book about the conservative conference that took place several years ago, the first conservative conference, and you say that most of the speakers were religious, wearing a kippah, as well as people in the audience. So this is just one anecdotal example, but it really reflects the fact that many of the movers and shakers of that new Americanized Israeli right are indeed people from religious Zionism, and also the fact that it is not just religious, but it's also a nationalist religious groups, whether it's Jewish nationalism in Israel and also white nationalism in America. Now, here is a fundamental difference where religion is really such a central part in the political culture in Israel, whereas in America, it is obviously a very religious country, but still not politically. There's really this very fundamental separation between church and state. How does that travel across the pond?
Well, this is the big question. Can you even have an Israeli conservatism? Because some of the people, also in our book, again, this is a debate, right? They say, well, you know what? There's not really a conservatism the way Americans are imagining or would like to see. What you really have is just the religious Zionism that's developed, and here and there, right? Tzionut Datit, right? So religious Zionism, people like Bennett, who's now they hate him, right? Because he's too moderate for them. But it's like Smotrich maybe would be one, I think, person who personifies this
Bennett,
movement.
By the way, was second generation American.
Of course, and again, Bennett's very interesting. We wanted to bring in an article about him as well, because he's very right. His parents are from the United States. His English, right? Bennett's a very important part of this story as well, I think. Different from Netanyahu, I think, maybe more authentic in the sense, right? Because he does come from, I think, real religious Zionism, and yet you see his own kind of evolution in the last decade. But a lot of people believe that there is no Israeli conservatism as a new hybridity or something like that. All you have is religious Zionism, right, which has been repackaged. And here and there and then, again, this is what one of the debates within religious Zionism is, because, so it's, all right, so you have nationalism, right, and you have Jewish kind of, right, the central role of religion and Judaism, kind of what we'd call a social conservatism in the United States that we associate with evangelicals or political Catholics and so forth, right, so you have them. But then I think the great question here that maybe divides the Israeli right is, what do you do with these libertarian American ideas? That's the big thing, right? And again, for many of the Americans, that's the important stuff. It's not, it's the economics and the legal, which is really and the legal reforms are aimed to facilitate the economics. And again, I don't want to bring in a Marxist discourse, but there's certain things that even today, long since the Cold War has ended, right? We have to understand, and I think it's this idea that Israel, we have to remember, Israel was created as a social democracy. Many of our institutions to this day, which I personally am very thankful for, are the remnants, right, or the results of that. That means relatively strong labor unions. Relative, I say that because as we saw recently in a labor strike that was supposed to significantly effect and freeze really Israeli society didn't do it. It was almost its results were almost negligible. It was almost pathetic, I have to say. I'm sorry to say, but things like labor unions, things like regulation of the economy, of privatization, right? These are the big things. These are the things that really shape our lives at the end of the day, in our everyday lived experiences, and these are the things that libertarians, that what we call free market neoliberals, have imported into Israel. Netanyahu did this when he was Minister of Finance, 20 years ago. He himself believes in the stuff, with Thatcher and Reagan, those types of economic policies, right? Free market policies. But this is something that a lot of religious Zionists have a problem digesting.
Because they rely on state handouts in many ways.
Well, first of all, because the state is so central for them in the West Bank, where, again, this is the irony. Some of them say, right, we want to have this libertarian free market within the green lines, right, within recognized Israel. So that means get the government out of regulating the economy. We want to privatize everything. We want to privatize education. We want to privatize healthcare. Again, these are things that even in the United States, they haven't been able to succeed in most cases, even though there is no public universal healthcare. Despite Obamacare and attempts to fix that in America in the last decade or so, right? So this is things they want to bring to Israel, and these are things that are fundamentally at odds, I think, with Israeli culture and certainly Israeli institutions and our social democratic nature, what's left of it. So here's a great contradiction that the same people who are saying, right, get the government out of our lives in the economy, in politics, in education, in healthcare, right? They're the same as they're saying, wait, but when it comes to the West Bank, when it comes to controlling Palestinian lives, when it comes to, people who live in the West Bank, settlers, they have, in a way, they have a lot of tax breaks, right? They have a lot of rights and benefits that Israelis who don't, who live in the green zone, which is kind of the pre-1967 lines, Israeli borders, right, that they don't have. And again, so this is a huge contradiction because it's like saying, okay, I'm for a welfare state as long as it's about the security situation, the West Bank, but when it comes to the economic stuff, the legal stuff, get the government out of my business. And of course, this is you can call it hypocrisy, or at the very least, it's a philosophical contradiction.
Yeah. I want to talk about the people behind these initiatives, people who actually bankroll all this. And as we said, there's a lot of money involved in it. American Jews who are strictly on the right, with a lot of money to spend and choose, first of all, to break from the Jewish American consensus that is overwhelmingly liberal and has been for decades, if not forever, and also take this money and invest it in Israel, rather than in Jewish American projects. How do you understand the motivations of these people? Where do they come from?
Well, again, it's difficult to generalize. I think originally, obviously, and certainly philanthropy by American Jews has been around since before 1948, and it's been a really important part of Israeli society in a good way. I think but
they never had an agenda, like such a specific agenda. It was
right.
They gave money to Israel so that Israel do whatever they want with it.
Right. The philanthropy, even before 1990s, in the earliest decades of the state, some of it was oriented because they wanted to develop certain parts of Israeli society, to help certain parts of Israeli society. And that's fair. I think that's fine. What happens, I think, since the 1990s is, again, this is the moment that you see the attempt to construct an alternative intellectual foundation in Israel. And again, this is right out of the American conservative playbook. It's this understanding that if we want to change, or in their minds at least, and again, I'm not saying this in a pejorative manner. I think it's fair to say, well, all right, I would like to see Israel have more ideas. If you believe in Reagan, and a lot of Americans do, and that's fine, right? And it says, if you believe in a lot of these ideas, then how do you institutionalize them in Israel? And the thought of at least some of these philanthropists and organizations was, right, let's start an intellectual movement. How do you do that, right? You obviously, with money, this was also the story in the United States in the 40s and 50s. That's how American conservatives are established, through think tanks, right? Because the idea is here, we need ideas. Ideas matter, right? So where do you get ideas from, right? You fund think tanks, you fund academia, professorships, right? And this is a story of American conservatism. You fund journals, right? In the United States, you have National Review. It's a very important moment in 1955 when it's founded. So you could start circulating these ideas and debating them. Publishing houses, right? And that's what happens in Israel, right? The Shalem Center, Merkaz Shalem, it's since become a liberal arts college. It starts as one of these places, right? Later on, you mentioned Kohelet, and there's Keren Tikva, which helps fund some of these ventures. But it's these think tanks, Machon Argaman, right? Herzl. But I think Kohelet, because of it's how closely it's tied to American money. This was the idea. It was we fund think tanks. We fund journals, right? All of them had journals. Shalem to this day has, I think, one of the best presses in Israel. And they say, right, let's start translating stuff, publishing stuff. That's how you generate a new conversation, right? So that's how you kind of import and implant these ideas in the 90s. And I think they did that. And again, in and of itself, first of all, it's very revolutionary. But it's also it's a fair thing to say if you're a Jewish American and you're looking at Israel and you think these ideas are good ideas, then I think it was a legitimate thing to do. The problem is when these ideas mature and what happens to them, which is what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years, you could see how they could lead actually to some things which I think are quite dangerous.
Yeah, and if we consider the backlash to the judicial overhaul that was initiated in many ways by these people that you're talking about, at least facilitated by them, has anything changed? I mean, this book is based on a conference that and papers that were written as of 2021. I mean, the failure, or at least the a pause in these proposals for judicial reviews are relatively recent. I mean, 2023, 2024. I mean, is there any a recalculation of the political landscape and the political program?
You mean in Israel?
Yeah.
I think it's too early to tell, but this is a great example of how I think certain ideas that that begin to circulate 20, 30 years ago, how this is the end result, and it's not a good end result. And again, there's a lot of good things that Americanization brings to Israel, I think. And I think it's obviously in general, I think America has done much more good for the world than bad, and I'm very happy, and most of us I think benefit that. But here you see a very bad example and dangerous example of taking something from the United States that really emerges in the 80s, right? What we call originalism, and this idea of politicizing the judiciary. And this is something that the Federalist Society does, and since the early 80s in the United States, understanding that, well, if we want to change American society, right, we have the political economy, we have the White House, we have corporations, right, we have kind of a lot of these, but we need the courts. And they do that in a very strategic, methodic manner. And these things take decades. And again, you have to have patience in that sense, right? And American conservatives were very successful in doing that, because what started in the 80s really it reaches its fruition and kind of culminates a few years ago with the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022, right? That's it. And a lot of them, that's what they were thinking. And we know that, right? Since they say, how do we change the legal structure? How do we change the Supreme Court? And again, this Supreme Court has been very generous to Trump, right? He appointed 3 of its members, his most conservative members. But this is, again, the irony here. This is a way, I think, that you can revolutionize, you can transform society in a sweeping manner. So they start thinking about doing this in Israel, right? And here, the way the Likud has done this, and Yariv Levin, I think, is a very anti-conservative manner, right?
The justice minister was proposed.
Right, sorry, yeah, right. You're right. The justice minister, very controversial figure, right? And again, if in America it's very gradual and almost organically growing within the right, here they bring it in, they try to square the circle and impose it, first of all, very violently, just in terms of saying we have the votes, even though they have a couple of votes, by mistake since the 2022 election. And they say, now we're going to overhaul, we're going to transform Israel's whole legal system. And again, not because we had a huge election, like whatever Johnson has in the United States in 64, or Roosevelt has in 32, that allows them really to transform society. But they have a very small, a couple tens of thousands of votes that allow them to after 4 attempts to finally allow Netanyahu to create a government in 2022. And they say now we're going to totally transform the legal system. So that in itself is anti-conservative, right? That's antithetical to conservatism, which wants the first thing conservatives cherish is institutions. And if you change institutions, right, this goes back to Edmund Burke, of course, and Tocqueville, all these, these great political philosophers in 18th, 19th century Europe that influenced American conservatives. The whole idea that you change it gradually, organically, through some kind of moderation and compromise. Here they do the exact opposite. So it's just almost revolutionary in terms of
So do you think they've learned the lesson?
In Israel?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't think they learned the lesson. No, I don't think they're going to stop.
Are there any voices within those? Perhaps not the government, but in the think tanks and the intellectual.
Well, of course, many of them have taken a step back. If you look at a lot of the statements, first off, some of the American, because of the judicial reform, this is even before October 7th, because we forgot about everything that happened before. A lot of them took a step back and said, Arthur Adamczyk, one of the significant donors, he said, "I'm all right. I'm cutting off funds, right?" Because he was I think he didn't expect that backlash. And again, a lot of the donors didn't think this was going to happen. Certainly, those who gave money 10, 20, 30 years ago, they didn't think this is the way to do it. I think many of them were shocked by how aggressive and how again, you're trying to transform Israeli society. Maybe if you have overwhelming consensus, like winning a really overwhelming victory, or having the compromises with the opposition, that gives you the legitimacy to totally change Israeli society, which is what Levin, the justice minister, wants to do in this plan. But to do it like this, almost as it's kind of in Israel we call it michtaf, right? It's kind of how would I translate that?
That's a good question.
But it's really to do something without having the legitimacy, the support to do it, just because technically maybe you have a couple of the votes. But just again, getting back to this topic, this is a great example, I think, of the dangers of the Americanization of the Israeli right, which, as I said, has a lot of, I think, potentially positive things. This is not one of them, because what you're trying to do here, you're taking the American system of government, which is rooted in a separation of powers, in a certain political tradition of individualism and liberalism.
And institutions that Israel doesn't have.
First and foremost, in institutions that Israel does not have. And this was so key. And this is something I tried to make the case in America, and a lot of American neoconservatives and the Kohelet crowd, I think they didn't like that at all, right? But again, and this I know a lot of our listeners are in North America, and it's very important to understand these things are legitimate. Some of the things that the judicial reform wanted to do are legitimate if you are living in the United States and you have the Bill of Rights, which we do not have in Israel. So you have a constitution which is very difficult to reform because it guarantees your civil liberties. Israel doesn't have that. The United States has what we call dual government, right? In a way, power is distributed, right, between the federal government and the state and the local. We don't have that in Israel. All power is in the executive and in the legislative. In the United States, because of the separation of powers, you have the executive and Congress and the president, the executive and the legislative are totally separate. And so they balance each other out. That's the whole point of checks and balances, right? In Israel, we don't have that. The parliamentary system gives all of the power to the executive that controls the legislative, right? The government is created out of the majority in the parliament, so it controls that majority as well.
No bicameral parliament.
No, and right, and again, remember, think about it. In the United States, you have the Senate and the House of Representatives. The whole point of that, again, that's derived from British parliamentary tradition, is to balance these forces, not to allow any one body to have overwhelming power, right? None of these things exist in Israel. And we don't have the constitution that protects our individual rights. So think what that means. That means anyone with a majority, even a slight majority, one vote majority in the parliament, right? Kind of having 61 votes. And unfortunately, given the polarization of Israeli society, that's been the situation here for the past decade. They could change everything. And that's what Levin is really, that's what this plan was trying to do. And that, I think that is so dangerous because it removes all the guarantees that minorities in Israel have, that women have, that LGBTQ have, that Palestinians have, that there will be, nothing to protect them, to protect us, right? Anyone who opposes the majority, and this, of course, what Tocqueville famously called the tyranny of the majority.
And here, perhaps, it goes back to what we talked about earlier about the composition of this wing of the Israeli right. It is overwhelmingly a radical, religious, perhaps, supremacist to an extent. And so this is exactly what, you see it as dangerous. They see it as desirable.
Well, they're the ones who've always wanted this. To their credit, ideologues and dogmatists are always very consistent. This is something that look, who are the biggest advocates of this? It's not Netanyahu. This is very. I think we know this just from press accounts that Netanyahu, when the judicial reform was getting out of hand and he saw the pushback, he wanted to suspend it. He wanted to take a step back. Right? Netanyahu, if you look at his attitude, towards the Israeli Supreme Court, towards those very judges like the former Supreme Court Aaron Barak, who's become so vilified, right, by this movement. Netanyahu admires them. You Google this, see what he said about Beinish, about all these, all the justices that unfortunately have been vilified in the last few years. Netanyahu admired them. I think genuinely inside of him, he still does. It's only after his legal troubles and his trials that suddenly he saw this in a very utilitarian manner as a way to maybe just to get himself out of trouble. But the other people, the people who most support it, who really support it, it's Smotrich, it's Ben Gvir, right? These are, of course, the two most salient representatives of the settlers. It's people like Levin. It's the ideologues who, first and foremost, support the expansion and the annexation of the West Bank, right? Maybe the biggest barrier to doing that, the only institution in Israel that still protects Palestinians, that prevents, Israeli settlers from just taking their lands, is the Supreme Court. And many of the settlers have been, they've been open about this. For decades they've said they are in our way. This is one of the institutions we need to neutralize or change in order to be able to achieve our ideological dreams of Eretz Yisrael Shlema, right? Of kind of ruling the West Bank.
Yeah. All right, Yoav Fromer, thank you very much for joining us today. And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And we would like to ask you to please consider writing a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 1,000 interviews by now, if not more. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. And most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.